Genevieve felt her heart tighten as she entered the jewelry store. It wasn't her intention to buy anything, just to glance at the displays. Maybe find something that could bring a tiny spark of joy, even if it was faint, after months of mourning. Since Caleb, her husband and the love of her life, had passed away in a tragic accident, everything seemed like a blur of grey tones. She moved through life on autopilot, trying to rediscover herself in a world that now felt so empty. As her eyes scanned the sparkling windows, she felt an inexplicable chill. There was something in the room, or rather someone. Genevieve could hardly believe what she was seeing. On the other side of the store, talking to the jeweler, was a man who looked exactly like Caleb. Same height, same skin tone, and even the smile that had so often made her forget about the world was right there in front of her. Her heart skipped a beat and her legs wobbled. Could it be? She thought, still in disbelief, as the man turned to leave the store. On impulse, Genevieve followed him. She didn't really know what she was doing, but she couldn't let this opportunity slip away. She trailed him down the streets, trying to keep a safe distance so she wouldn't be noticed. With every step he took, every gesture he made, it was as if he was replaying the way Caleb used to walk, the way he would look around, even how he would fix his hair. It was almost as if a part of her, a part that had been abruptly and painfully ripped away, was being returned. Genevieve couldn't tear her eyes away, as if simply letting him vanish from sight would be a second loss, one she wasn't prepared to face again. At some point he stopped in front of a small cafe. Genevieve hesitated, but moved closer enough to hear his conversation with a friend. They talked about traveling, mentioning places that she and Caleb had always dreamed of visiting, but never had the chance. Everything felt eerily familiar, as though this man knew intimate details of the life she and Caleb had shared. However, she noticed that they called him Nolan. The name snapped her out of her trance, but it also confused her. How could he look so much like Caleb, yet be so unfamiliar? In the following days, Genevieve could hardly think of anything else. It was a mix of longing and hope, but also a strange fear. Who was this man who looked so much like Caleb, and why did she feel so connected to him? Every time she remembered that face, she felt an inexplicable urge to know more, to understand what was really going on. Could it be that Caleb had a twin brother he had never mentioned? Was it just a coincidence, someone who simply looked like him? Determined not to leave the question unanswered, Genevieve began to investigate Nolan's life. She found out where he worked, learned of some mutual friends, and even started visiting the cafe where he often went. Slowly, each detail about him was revealed, but it also began to blend with memories she had of Caleb. At times, she could barely distinguish where Nolan ended and where her memories of her husband began, and it disturbed her. But it also intrigued her, as if she were on a quest that could change the meaning of everything she believed. Finally, Genevieve found an opportunity to approach Nolan. He was at the same cafe, and she decided to take the risk. She walked up to him, her heart racing, and asked if he also felt like they had known each other before. Nolan looked at her in surprise, but also with an expression that suggested some sort of recognition, though uncertain. As they shared their stories, they discovered an unexpected connection between their lives. They both shared memories of places, tastes, and even similar passions. It was as if fate had woven a web of coincidences between them, defying any rational explanation. At the end of each meeting, Genevieve left with the feeling that there was something bigger behind it all. Perhaps a new chance to heal her heart, or maybe a final gift from Caleb, a chance to experience love in a completely new way. Genevieve sat at the kitchen table, watching the trembling hands of Franklin, her father-in-law, as he held a cup of tea, almost too afraid to look at her. There was something in the silence, something that seemed to hang in the air, a secret kept for a long time. Franklin, normally a calm and reserved man, now seemed overtaken by a kind of anxiety, as if he were about to open a door he had kept shut for years. "Genevieve," he began hesitantly, searching for words that even he wasn't sure how to say, "there's something you need to know." Something I should have told you a long time ago." His voice was low, filled with guilt, but also with a protective warmth that seemed to envelop Genevieve like an embrace. Caleb. Caleb wasn't an only child. Genevieve held her breath. It was not something she expected to hear. Caleb had meant everything to her, and the idea that there could be someone in the world with whom he shared a blood bond was almost unimaginable. "Caleb had a brother," she whispered, feeling a mix of surprise, curiosity, and also a certain fear about what this revelation might mean. Franklin nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yes, a twin brother, actually. His name was Miles." For a moment, he stared into space, as if seeing images from the past projected in front of him, memories that Genevieve couldn't even begin to imagine. They were so small, identical to each other. No one could tell them apart. It was almost magical seeing them together, but it was also dangerous. Genevieve furrowed her brow. "Dangerous? What do you mean by that, Franklin?" She could hardly believe all of this was happening, that suddenly Caleb seemed to be so much more than the man she knew and loved. He was part of a story Genevieve hadn't even known existed. Franklin leaned back in his chair, as if the weight of the memories was almost unbearable. Back then, our family was going through a complicated situation. There was a threat, a group of people who believed our children were somehow tied to an ancient curse in our family. He paused, his eyes fixed on some invisible point, while Genevieve tried to process what she was hearing. They thought one of the boys, being twins, was destined to be different, to bring bad luck to the family. Genevieve felt a chill as she heard that. It sounded like a story from another time, a tale of ancient superstitions that had somehow infiltrated their lives. "So, you gave him up for adoption, to protect them?" The idea was almost surreal. She couldn't imagine what it would have been like to give up a child in the hope of saving the other. Franklin nodded, but Genevieve noticed the look of pain on his face, as if each word cost him a piece of his soul. "It was the hardest decision of our lives, but it seemed like the only way to ensure Caleb would be safe," Franklin confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "We thought Miles might have a better chance if he was raised by another family, far from ours, away from any threat. And so, we made that decision." He lowered his head, letting out a long sigh. "All these years, I thought I had done the right thing, but now everything seems to be coming back. It doesn't surprise me that you saw someone who looked just like Caleb. That man, Miles, must be him." Genevieve could barely process the information. This discovery made the very ground of her reality tremble. She felt as though every memory she had of Caleb now held a new layer, a shadow of a secret he might never have known. Did he know? Caleb knew he had a twin brother? Her voice was strained, and a part of her feared the answer. Franklin shook his head. "No, we never had the courage to tell him. We wanted him to have a peaceful life, free from worries about something he couldn't change. But now, maybe it was their destiny to meet after all." Genevieve let out a long, deep sigh. She felt as if she had stepped into a labyrinth where every path led to more secrets, more questions. "Franklin, do you know where Miles might be now? I need to understand who he is and maybe finally give an answer to my heart." A part of her wanted to find in Miles a piece of Caleb that was still alive, but there was also a part that feared what that meeting might mean. And deep down, the most profound and disturbing question of all, who was the man she had loved, really? As Franklin looked at her with understanding and sadness, Genevieve felt that this was only the beginning of a journey that would force her to confront secrets from the past, choices that had shaped the future, and perhaps a destiny that had always been waiting to be discovered. Genevieve felt her heart race as she approached Miles. He was sitting on a park bench, his back to her, and for a moment she hesitated. She had mentally rehearsed what she would say many times, but now that she was so close, the words seemed to fail her. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage, and finally spoke. "Sorry to bother you, but I think we need to talk." Miles turned around, surprised to see Genevieve, recognizing her from a previous meeting at the cafe, but not understanding the reason for the approach. She noticed a look of confusion on his face and felt the weight of what she was about to say. It wasn't going to be easy to explain or to hear, but the truth needed to come out. "I know this is going to sound strange, but you look so much like someone who was very important to me," she began, trying to choose her words carefully. "His name was Caleb. He was my husband." Miles furrowed his brow, intrigued. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand where you're going with this. I don't know any Caleb." There was a hint of impatience in his voice, a reaction from someone who didn't want to believe they could be involved in any personal story of strangers. Genevieve took a deep breath. She didn't know how to convince him without sounding crazy. "I know it sounds absurd," she said, feeling the weight of each word, "but Caleb wasn't an only child. He had a twin brother, a brother who was separated from him when they were very young. And I think that brother is you, Miles." She noticed he was about to interrupt, so she quickly continued, "Please, just listen. You are his image, not just the way you look, but the way you walk, the way you look, everything. I know this is hard to believe, but Caleb never knew about you." Miles let out a short laugh, an attempt to downplay what he had just heard, but there was a slight tremor in his voice. "Look, this must be some kind of mistake. I've always known who I am, and I've never heard anything about a brother, let alone a twin. It just doesn't make sense." He stood up, as if to walk away, but stopped when he saw Genevieve's expression, so full of determination but also something else, a deep pain that seemed almost tangible. Before he could take another step, she opened her purse and pulled out a small photo that Franklin had given her. It was an old picture, slightly faded by time, showing two small boys holding hands, identical, with expressions of pure innocence. She extended the photo to Miles, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "Just look." He took the photo, reluctantly. His face changed as he looked at the image, his eyes fixating on the faces of the children. The earlier laughter faded, replaced by a mix of shock and recognition. There was something in the faces of those boys that seemed familiar, something that triggered a sense of déjà vu, a flash of a memory he didn't even know he had crossed his mind, a fragment of a distant time. He felt a pressure in his chest, as if something inside him were breaking apart to reshape itself into something completely new. "These boys," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at Genevieve, confused but now also deeply shaken. You really think this is me?" Genevieve nodded, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. "I don't just think it, I know it. And I know this is a lot to process, but I think you deserve to know. Caleb was a wonderful man, someone I loved more than anything. And he had a brother. I never imagined I would find you, but now that I'm here, I needed to tell you." Miles fell silent, still processing the idea. He looked at the photo, then at Genevieve, trying to find some logical explanation for something that seemed so surreal. "But if this is true, why didn't I know? Why didn't my family ever tell me anything about this?" Genevieve sighed, realizing the moment had come to share everything Franklin had told her. "Your adoption was done in secret to protect both of you. There was a threat against your family, a superstition, something old. Your parents thought the only way to keep Caleb safe was to separate you." Miles' face contorted in a mix of disbelief and hurt. "So, I was abandoned to protect someone else?" He seemed torn between anger and sadness, as if part of him wanted to believe, but another part resisted. It was a whirlwind of emotions he didn't know how to process. Genevieve gently placed her hand on his shoulder, trying to offer some comfort. "I know it's hard, and I know this doesn't justify what happened. But you weren't abandoned. It was a decision made out of fear, made at a time when people thought differently, and maybe not always in the best way. But what matters is that you're not alone in this. I'm here, and I'd like to get to know you better. Maybe for Caleb." For a long moment, Miles remained silent, looking once again at the photo, absorbing every detail. Finally, he sighed, as if the resistance inside him was slowly dissolving. I don't know what to do with all of this, Genevieve, but maybe we can talk more." Genevieve smiled, relieved and with a heart full of new hope. Miles was a living connection to the past, a part of Caleb she never imagined she'd find, but now he seemed to be an essential piece of a bigger story, a story that was only just beginning to be told. The news of Mr. Franklin's illness came to Genevieve unexpectedly, like a cold wave that enveloped her entirely. He was weak, more than he had ever been, and the doctors were honest about the gravity of the situation. The past few months had been filled with difficult revelations and hidden truths, but now, with Franklin so frail, Genevieve knew that time was running out, and there was something she needed to do, something that he, perhaps secretly, also wanted. It was time for Miles to know the whole truth. Genevieve knew she couldn't let time or fate take away Miles's chance to meet his father, even if only in his final moments. Franklin deserved to see the other son, the one he had never been able to meet, and Miles deserved to finally understand his roots. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision, but with the certainty that she could no longer delay the inevitable meeting. That afternoon, Genevieve went to Miles' house. He opened the door, surprised to see her, but soon noticed the serious look on her face. "Genevieve, what happened? You look worried," he said, furrowing his brow, a mix of concern and curiosity. Genevieve hesitated for a second, but decided to be direct. "Miles, your father is very sick, and I think you deserve to meet him before it's too late." Those words were hard to say aloud, almost as if speaking the reality made it even more painful. Miles fell silent, and she could see confusion and surprise taking over his face. "My father?" Miles repeated slowly, as if trying to understand something that had always been a mystery to him. The word father sounded strange, almost unreal, as if it were part of a distant story and yet too close. The idea of having a biological family, someone who, even though not present in his life, was part of his history, was something he had never allowed himself to imagine. Genevieve nodded, her eyes full of resigned sadness. "Yes, Miles, Mr. Franklin is your father. He was the one who made the decision to put you up for adoption when you and Caleb were just babies, to protect you from a threat, something he believed was dangerous. It was a painful choice, made to preserve both of your lives. But now he's very sick, and I think deep down he would like to see you." Miles looked away, clearly overwhelmed by a storm of emotions. Part of him felt anger for being separated from his own family, as if he had been deprived of a life that could have been different. But another part, a quieter and deeper part, felt a mix of curiosity and pain, a need to understand the truth, and perhaps in some way to find some peace. I don't know, Genevieve," he said, his voice trembling as he looked at his hands. "How can I just show up like that? What would I say, and does he really want to see me?" The doubts hung in the air, as if the idea of facing his own past was almost unbearable. Genevieve placed her hand over his, trying to convey strength. "Miles, I know it's a lot to process, but this might be the only opportunity you have to meet him. And maybe, somehow, the two of you can find the answers you've always been searching for. I know he regretted that decision. He's lived with it for years. Maybe this is your chance to forgive each other, or at least to understand that choices aren't always easy." Miles looked at her, absorbing every word. He knew, deep down, that Genevieve was right. Part of him had always felt that something was missing, an incomplete connection that now, perhaps he had the chance to fill. With a deep sigh, he made his decision. "Okay, Genevieve, I want to meet him, at least once." The next day, Genevieve took Miles to Franklin's house. The drive there was silent, each of them lost in their thoughts, as the gravity of the moment settled in. When they arrived, Genevieve gently knocked on the door and went in first, finding Franklin sitting in an armchair, his face pale, his eyes tired, but still with a glimmer of hope. "Franklin," she said softly, approaching him, "I brought someone to see you." With a gentle gesture, Genevieve motioned for Miles to come in. Franklin looked at the door, And when he saw the young man, his eyes filled with silent tears. It was as if he were seeing a reflection of himself, a piece of his life that he had never been able to live up close. The words seemed to escape him, but the emotion between them was palpable, a connection that time and secrecy had not been able to erase. Miles stepped forward, hesitant. He didn't know exactly what to say, but the look on Franklin's face said everything that needed to be said. There, in that moment, they were simply a father and son, finally finding each other, even if in a moment of pain. Miles broke the silence, his voice low and almost reverent. "I'm Miles, and I came to meet my father." Franklin smiled, though weakly, but enough for Miles to see the love contained in that gesture. With a soft and choked voice, he replied, "My son, you've always been my son." The morning Genevieve and Miles arrived at the hospital, the air was thick with a mixture of anticipation and silence. Miles walked beside her down the long, cold hallways, trying to prepare himself for the moment ahead. The weight of that decision, to face a father he hardly knew, but whose absence he had always felt, even without understanding the reason, seemed to grow with each step he took. Genevieve felt his tension and, as they stopped in front of the hospital room door, placed a hand on Miles's shoulder. "I know this is hard, but you're not alone," she said softly, trying to offer some comfort in the midst of the emotional whirlwind. Miles nodded, took a deep breath, and decided that no matter what happened, he needed to do this. When he entered the room, he saw Mr. Franklin lying in bed, pale but with a faint smile on his face. The illness had left him frail, yet upon seeing Miles, his eyes lit up with a surprising strength. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment for years, as if simply having Miles there by his side gave him a breath of life. "Hi, Dad," Miles said, the words still sounding strange, but also full of meaning. He couldn't stop looking at Franklin's face, noticing, perhaps for the first time, the resemblance between them. A silent familiarity, a detail here and there that reflected a connection that had always existed, even though they had lived apart. Franklin smiled, moved, and extended his hand, which Miles took with a care that was almost reverent. "You have no idea how long I've waited for this," Franklin said, in a low but steady voice. "Life, it has a complicated way of bringing back what we've lost, even if it's too late." There was a soft bitterness in his words, but also an acceptance. He looked at Miles as if he wanted to absorb every detail, as if each moment could make up for the years of distance between them. Miles felt a tightness in his chest, as if something inside him, a space he didn't even know existed, was finally beginning to fill. The anger and hurt he had felt over the absence of this father was starting to give way to something new, an understanding, a silent connection he had never expected to find. He squeezed Franklin's hand a little tighter, letting the silence between them become something profound, something words couldn't explain. "I've always wondered who I really was, where I came from," Miles confessed, feeling the emotion overflow. "And now, somehow, it's like you're the missing piece." Franklin closed his eyes for a moment, struggling against the tears. "And you, my son, you've always been with me, even without knowing it. Not a day went by that I didn't wonder how you were, where you were, and now, having you here, it's like a gift life has given me, a final chance to feel that somehow our story can still be completed." Those words deeply touched Miles's heart. He sat down next to the bed, not letting go of Franklin's hand, and shared a little about his life, about the small things Franklin had missed out on, childhood stories, accomplishments, and challenges he wished he could have shared, so Franklin could, at least for a moment, feel that he had been a part of it all. Franklin listened intently, his eyes shining with both pride and sadness. "I see so much of myself in you, Miles," he said, his voice soft and filled with emotion. "You're the son I always wanted to know, and even though time kept us apart, today, here, I feel my heart at peace." Those words filled the room with a calm, almost sacred, as if the mere fact that they were together was a remedy for both of their wounded hearts. Miles, for the first time, felt that the emptiness left by the absence of a family was beginning to fade. And Franklin, looking at the son he had never been able to raise, felt that he could finally leave in peace, knowing that, at least for a brief moment, he had the chance to be Miles's father. When the visit ended, Miles stood up, hesitant to let go of Franklin's hand, as if every second more was precious. "Thank you, Dad," he said, the word now flowing naturally, filled with a love he never knew existed. Franklin smiled one last time, nodding, his eyes full of serene peace, knowing that this encounter had been everything he had ever wished for. As he left the room, Miles looked back one last time, carrying with him the certainty that, despite all the years of separation, they had found each other in a way that nothing could erase. That night, the hospital seemed quieter than ever, as if it were holding its breath along with all those anxiously waiting outside Mr. Franklin's room. Genevieve and Miles were there, side by side, as the doctors did their best to stabilize him after a sudden heart attack. The world seemed to stand still, and Miles felt a pain he didn't know would be so intense, as if he were on the verge of losing a father for the second time, even though he had just met him. But against all odds, Mr. Franklin survived. The doctors said he still needed plenty of rest, but his heart had held strong, as if something more powerful was keeping him there. And when Genevieve and Miles entered the room, Franklin's tired yet somehow bright eyes met theirs, and he smiled, his expression full of gratitude for being there, for having a little more time. Genevieve helped Franklin adjust in bed, supporting him carefully. He looked at Miles and Genevieve, as if gathering strength for what he wanted to say. "I thought this was my last chance," he said, his voice hoarse but filled with a new tenderness. "But it seems life still wants to give me some time with you." He held Miles's hand, the grip stronger than the young man expected, and looked directly at him, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. "There are so many things I wish I could tell you about Caleb," Franklin began, his voice trembling but with a spark of pride in his eyes. He was a strong boy, full of dreams and very dedicated. Since he was little, he had a gleam in his eyes that made us believe he could accomplish anything. Miles listened to every word, feeling like a child hearing magical stories for the first time. He could imagine Caleb as a boy, running through fields, facing the world with that same spirit Genevieve had described. Franklin continued, his eyes full of longing but also affection. "Caleb was stubborn, you know," Franklin said, laughing softly. "Once, he decided to build a treehouse, even after we all told him he was too small to do it. But he didn't give up. He spent the whole summer gathering pieces of wood, finding tools, and one day, he did it. It was a crooked little house, but it was his." Franklin smiled, remembering the scene as if he could still see Caleb there, sweaty and proud of his own work. Miles laughed, picturing his little brother, determined and stubborn, much like himself in many ways. "And he was generous too," Franklin continued, looking at Genevieve with tenderness. When he met Genevieve, it was like his whole world revolved around her. He talked about her with such affection, as if he had found something precious, something he wanted to protect forever. I remember the night he came to tell me he wanted to marry her. He was nervous, worried he wouldn't be good enough, but I had never seen anyone so determined to make someone happy. Genevieve, hearing these words, felt tears well up in her eyes, reliving those moments in her mind. It felt as if Caleb was there, alive in the stories Franklin told, in the memories that filled the air with a sense of peace and nostalgia. With each story, Miles felt more connected to the brother he never knew, and also to his father. Hearing about Caleb was like a part of his own identity was being revealed, as if he were finally understanding a little more about who he was. And as he looked at Franklin, he saw not just a father, but a man who carried a deep and lasting love, both for the son he had raised and the one he had to leave behind. Franklin squeezed Miles's hand once more, tears in his eyes. "I know I could never be with you, Miles, and nothing can erase the time I lost. But now you're here. And Caleb, wherever he is, I know he's happy about this too. You both have always been a part of me, and now I have the chance to share that with you." Miles nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Dad." he said, the word coming out heavy with everything he felt: pain, longing and gratitude for having this chance to finally have a family, to understand his roots, and to feel that despite everything, he was part of this story alongside Caleb, alongside Franklin. In that moment, the hospital room seemed filled with something bigger than any of them, something that went beyond words. Franklin continued to tell stories, and each memory seemed to unite their hearts, like a bridge between the past and the present, strengthening a bond that, despite time and distance, had always been there, waiting for their reunion. The unexpected and intense meeting between Miles and Mr. Franklin marked the beginning of a deep transformation. It wasn't just the relief of finally meeting his biological father. It was as if, in that hospital room, they had managed to erase, even if just a little, the wounds of the past and the unanswered questions that had lingered for so long. And this newly discovered connection wasn't just affecting Miles and Franklin. Genevieve and Nathan, her young son with Caleb, were also beginning to be part of this new family forming, bringing together people who, until recently, hadn't even imagined the bonds that connected them. Genevieve noticed that Nathan, who was only 5, was becoming more and more curious about the uncle who looked so much like his father. The boy was still too young to understand the complexity of the story, but Genevieve knew he missed Caleb, and Miles's presence seemed to fill a special place in the boy's life. That Sunday, she decided to gather everyone at her house for lunch, hoping that these moments together could strengthen the bonds between them. The sun was shining as Genevieve carefully set the table, while Nathan ran around the yard, excited at the idea that his grandfather and Uncle Miles were coming to spend the day with him. When Franklin and Miles arrived, they were greeted by Genevieve's warm embrace and Nathan's infectious smile as he ran into his grandfather's arms, eager to show him his toys and the little house in the garden that he had helped his mother paint. As lunch was served, Miles watched the scene with a mix of surprise and contentment. He wasn't used to these family gatherings, but he strangely felt at home. Franklin, still a little weak, sat next to him, and as if he knew what his son was thinking, said softly, "You belong here, Miles. You belong to this family." Those words echoed in Miles's heart as he looked at Franklin, feeling a wave of emotion. The past, with all its doubts and resentments, seemed to lose the weight it had always carried, making room for something new, a sense of acceptance and affection he hadn't expected to feel. During lunch, the conversations flowed naturally. Franklin told Nathan a few stories about Caleb, who listened attentively, fascinated by hearing about his father's adventures when he was young. Miles, at first, remained quiet, but soon began to share his own stories, his experiences and discoveries throughout life. At times, he even spoke of Caleb, as if he could finally picture his brother by his side, as if the absence had been replaced by a symbolic presence, an invisible link that connected everyone there. After lunch, while Genevieve and Franklin rested in the living room, Nathan pulled Miles into the backyard. "Uncle Miles, do you want to play with me in the little house?" he asked, grinning from ear to ear, holding his uncle's hand as if he were his best friend. Miles smiled, charmed by the invitation, and together they entered the little wooden house Nathan called the fortress. Sitting there, Miles watched the boy as he talked about plans to defend the castle and hidden treasures in the yard, realizing how much he loved the boy, who in some way was a reflection of Caleb. A new wave of affection filled his heart, and he felt a genuine need to be there for Nathan, to be someone he could count on. As evening approached and everyone gathered again, Franklin, looking at his son, said in a serious tone but with a sincere smile, "Miles, I can't change what happened, but I can tell you that from now on, I want you to know you have a home. This is our home." He extended his hand, holding Genevieve's, and the other rested on Nathan's shoulder, who smiled with innocent joy in his eyes, happy to be surrounded by everyone he loved. Miles nodded, feeling a comfortable warmth inside his chest. "I feel the same. Maybe for a long time I've been searching for a place to call my own, and today I feel like I've found it. Maybe family really is that. People who share not just blood, but love, pain, and simple moments like this. Genevieve, with misty eyes, hugged Miles. Caleb would have loved to see this, she said, her voice thick with emotion. He always wanted Nathan to grow up surrounded by love and unity, and now we have that. We are a family, Miles. We're finally a family. That day, a new story began to be written. It wasn't a perfect story. There were pains that time couldn't erase, and memories that brought longing. But it was a real story, made of forgiveness, reconciliation, and affection. And together, Franklin, Genevieve, Miles, and Nathan learned to build something new. A family marked by love, where the emptiness of the past was filled with new memories, where the wounds slowly began to heal. And so, with each meeting, each conversation, each shared laugh, they moved forward, united by the memory of Caleb, by each other's presence, and by the promise of a new life as a family. On a quiet morning, Mr. Franklin woke up earlier than usual. The first rays of sunlight softly filtered through the cracks in the curtains, filling the room with a dim, peaceful light. But inside Franklin, his heart was far from at peace. There was something he had been carrying for years, a weight, a regret, and a need to say everything he had, never had the courage to confess to anyone. He knew that if he truly wanted to build something with Miles, he would need to start from a truthful place, even if it was painful. That afternoon, Franklin invited Miles for a walk in the park. Miles agreed, a little surprised but also curious about what his father wanted to discuss. They walked side by side, in silence for a long time, until Franklin stopped near an old oak tree, taking a deep breath as if preparing for a confession. "Miles," he began, his voice trembling, "I've kept things from you for so long, things you have the right to know." Franklin paused, his expression serious, and at the same time pained. "When you and Caleb were born, I made a decision that changed everything, that defined your life and mine. I left you behind, thinking that by doing so, I was protecting you and Caleb. I held on to that idea as an excuse, as a justification. But deep down, I knew this choice could never be fixed." Miles looked at him attentively, feeling the weight of his father's words. He already knew the reasons Franklin had shared with him, but he sensed there was more, and he was right. Franklin continued, his voice choked with regret. "I want you to know that not a single day went by that I didn't regret that choice. The thought that you, my son, were living a life without me, it hurts to know that I was wrong, that I was weak, that I hid behind fear and didn't face the consequences." Miles listened, feeling a mix of compassion and sadness. He saw in Franklin's eyes genuine pain, a truth that he himself could no longer deny. "I know you did what you thought was right at the time," Miles said, trying to hold back his own emotions. "But for a long time, I wondered why I was left behind, why I didn't have the right to grow up alongside Caleb. That doubt, it stayed with me for many years." Franklin nodded, feeling the tears welling up but not holding them back. "I know, my son, and that's why I'm here, to ask for your forgiveness. I know I can't go back in time, that words will never undo what's been done. But if there's anything at all, I can do to make up for at least some of the lost time, I'll do it. I want you to know that I'm here for you now, body and soul, and whatever you decide, I will accept." Miles took a deep breath, absorbing those words. There was pain, but there was also relief, a sense that finally the wounds of the past might begin to heal. He looked at his father, seeing in him not just the man who had made wrong choices, but someone who was trying to fix his mistakes, someone who wanted to be present, even if it was years too late. "Dad," Miles said, the word finally coming out naturally, as if everything he needed to hear had finally been said. "I accept your apology, and I think the only way forward is by being honest, learning to trust each other, and building our relationship from here on out. We can't recover the past, but we can do things differently from now on." Franklin smiled, a shy smile but full of hope. He felt the weight of years of guilt lifted, though not erased, and extended his hand to Miles, who shook it firmly. There, under the old oak tree, they sealed a kind of pact, a silent agreement that while they couldn't change what had been done, they could create a new story together, one where love and truth would be the pillars of their relationship. In the months that followed, Franklin and Miles began to meet regularly, truly getting to know each other, sharing stories, rediscovering what it meant to be father and son. Genevieve and Nathan joined in this new phase, creating moments when the whole family would gather, strengthening bonds that were finally free from the secrets and regrets Franklin had long feared. Time didn't erase everything, but it taught them all that the true family isn't perfect. It's the one that chooses to stay united, overcome the pain, and build day by day a relationship that goes beyond blood. As the months passed, Miles' presence in his new family's life became something natural, almost as if he had always been there. Gradually, he grew closer to each of them, building relationships that seemed to grow organically, without haste, but with a depth that surprised them all. For Miles, it felt like returning to a home he never knew existed, a place where he finally felt accepted and at peace. Genevieve, who had once carried a mix of pain and longing when thinking about Caleb, now found comfort in Miles, a chance to see reflections of her husband in small details. It wasn't that he replaced Caleb, it was as if he had his own space, his own light, and at the same time, he brought with him a new energy, a new hope. Miles was someone who truly cared about her and Nathan, someone who not only shared a blood tie, but also had a genuine desire to be part of that family. For little Nathan, Uncle Miles was the person he most enjoyed spending time with. There was an admiration in the boy's eyes that Miles felt as a gift. Slowly, he became the first one called for all the backyard games, to help with homework, and even to be the official partner in the adventures Nathan invented. One Sunday afternoon, while they were playing together in the yard, Nathan pulled Miles by the hand and led him to an old tree at the back of the garden. The boy looked up, pointing to a low branch. "Uncle Miles, do you think I can climb up there?" Miles smiled, remembering when he was a child, and tried to do exactly the same thing. "Of course you can, Nathan. You just need to go slow and trust each step, and I'll be right here to help you, if you need it." Nathan looked at him with eyes shining with excitement, confident simply because Miles was by his side. In just a few minutes, the boy reached the branch and shouted from the top, smiling as if he had conquered the world. "See, I told you, you could do it," Miles said, laughing and clapping for Nathan's accomplishment as the boy climbed down from the tree with a proud smile. That moment was small, but full of meaning. Miles felt he was fulfilling a role he had never imagined having, being someone Nathan could trust, someone who could inspire him, someone who was always there, like a safe point. Later, Genevieve watched the two of them through the window, moved to see them so connected. Miles's presence seemed to brighten Nathan's life, who had once silently shown he missed his father, but now seemed happier and more confident. He talked about Miles all the time, telling stories of their games, the advice, and even the tales the uncle shared about his own adventures. Genevieve knew that, in a way, Miles was filling the void Caleb had left. One night, while putting Nathan to bed, the boy looked at Genevieve with a serious expression, as if reflecting on something important. "Mom," he started, "do you think Daddy up in heaven is happy that I have Uncle Miles here with us?" Genevieve gently held her son's face, moved by the innocent and sincere question. "Yes, my love. I'm sure Daddy is very happy. He always wanted you to have someone to protect you, to be by your side. And Uncle Miles, he loves you very much, just like Daddy did." Nathan smiled, satisfied with the answer, and fell asleep with a peaceful expression. Genevieve stayed by his side for a few minutes, feeling that in some way Caleb was still present there. Not only in the memories, but in the acts of love Miles offered every day. It was as if the family was completing itself in a new, unexpected and genuine way. Over time, Miles also found his own peace. He discovered that he belonged to a place, a family that accepted him exactly as he was, with his flaws and his history. He no longer needed to carry the weight of doubts about his past or question where his home was. There, alongside Franklin, Genevieve, and Nathan, he found what he had always been searching for, a place of love, safety, and purpose. Miles was not only part of the family, but also an essential new piece, someone that Genevieve and Nathan felt they could always count on. And for him, that was all that mattered. Finally, he felt he had found his place, not just as Caleb's brother or Franklin's son, but as Miles, a presence that made all the difference in everyone's life. With the weight of the past finally forgiven and all the wounds transformed into acceptance, this family, once fractured by secrets, began walking toward a future full of possibilities. Each person's scars, though still present, had become silent marks, reminders of a journey of pain and overcoming that were now part of who they were but no longer defined them. Franklin, feeling renewed by his reconciliation with Miles and the constant presence of Genevieve and Nathan, seemed to gain a new vitality. The shadows of regret that once darkened his gaze were now replaced with a true peace, and he began to allow himself to live in the present with more lightness. Slowly, Franklin realized he still had much to offer as a father, grandfather, and friend. With every new conversation, every hug and smile exchanged, he understood that love had a unique way of healing, a force that brought with it the miracle of redemption. Genevieve also felt lighter and happier. There was a new shine in her eyes, a gratitude for having found in Miles a living link to Caleb, but also for having formed a new type of relationship with him. It was a connection of friendship, complicity, and affection that grew each day. Looking at Miles, she saw not only her husband's brother, but also a dear friend and a pillar for her family. She knew that with him and Franklin by her side, she could build a loving home for Nathan, a place where her son would grow up surrounded by the security of knowing that even after loss and challenges, their family was resilient and always united. For Nathan, life was full of adventures and learning. He saw his grandfather, mother, and Uncle Miles as examples of strength and love, and although his childhood was marked by the longing for a father he would never fully know, it was also filled with moments of joy and discovery. Nathan found in Miles a confidant, someone he could count on to share stories, fears, and dreams. They had a natural connection, as if they were meant to be together, and Miles devoted himself wholeheartedly to being a supportive figure for his nephew, offering the love that time had prevented Caleb from giving. One evening they were all gathered in the living room of Genevieve's house, and Nathan, after playing until he was exhausted, fell asleep in Miles's lap. Genevieve and Franklin watched them, their hearts warmed by the sight. There, in that small room, time seemed to stand still. They looked at each other with the silent understanding of those who had faced deep pain and now could breathe in peace, surrounded by the love that each of them had rediscovered. Franklin, moved, took the hands of Genevieve and Miles and, in an unexpected gesture, thanked them both. "You've given me a second chance, something I never thought I'd have," he said, his voice choked, but with a calm smile. "Seeing you all together, as a true family, gives me a peace I never imagined feeling. And knowing that Nathan will grow up surrounded by love, and that he'll have you, Miles, as an example, is a gift that Caleb, wherever he is, must also be celebrating." Miles, holding the hand of his sleeping nephew, looked at Franklin with gratitude and serenity. "We all make mistakes, and we all forgive, and now we're a family. I know I'll always miss Caleb, but I also know I've found my place here with you." Udi, those words sealed something definite, a commitment of love and presence that went beyond blood and loss, a commitment to be there for whatever came, supporting each other and moving forward. And so, with the past forgiven and hearts renewed, they embraced whatever life still had to offer. They walked together toward a promising future, where each morning was a chance to create new memories, to live a story that, despite the challenges, was being built with resilience, with the unconditional love that now flowed between them, and above all, with the certainty that they would never be alone again. It was the beginning of a new journey, one marked by love, unity, and the promise that, as long as they were together, they could face anything. This family, born of secrets and wounds, had finally reconciled with the past and was walking hand in hand toward a story full of hope and peace.